Hi, IB History Year 1 students. We're continuing our unit on the First World War, and this is video lesson number 8. And this video lesson is going to focus on enthusiasm and dissent among the civilian populations of the belligerent countries. This is the beginning of a series of lessons which focus on how the belligerent countries mobilized human and economic resources for the war effort. And clearly, the level of enthusiasm among civilians would influence how effectively each of those governments could mobilize human and economic resources. So this very first lesson is about enthusiasm and dissent. So we've talked about briefly, and you read about in Barbara Tuchman's book, The Guns of August, how in August of 1914, there seemed to be this outburst of public enthusiasm among the civilian populations upon the declarations of war. You had these great crowds, thousands of people in all of the capital cities of the belligerent countries, with the obvious notable exception of Brussels, Belgium, and that these crowds were there to express their excitement, their enthusiasm, their support for the war and for the national leadership that would lead the war effort. So you have these great cheering crowds. Uh, on the left, what you're seeing is a crowd listening to and cheering for the speech that was being made by Kaiser Wilhelm II upon the outbreak of war. On the right, you have crowds in Paris, again, waving the French tricolor. And I believe this is a group who are cheering young men who are going to volunteer on that very first day to enlist in the French army. So you get the idea. This was an apparently widespread phenomenon that transcended national boundaries. It seemed to be the case all across Europe that the public was excited about the war effort, enthusiastic about it, so that the job of the national governments perhaps was not going to be so difficult in stirring up and maintaining enthusiasm for the war, at least not at the very beginning. Now, many historians have challenged the concept of the August Madness. Not that these photographs are suggested to be inauthentic or something, but that the photographs represent uh, really not such a large proportion of the populations of these countries. That most people in these countries met the arrival of the war in a much more sober and studied way, and that the crowds who gathered in the public squares in the capital cities in early August of 1914, really, represented sort of the tip of the iceberg of these national populations, and that those who were not part of the tip were a lot like those of us who don't go to Times Square to celebrate New Year's Eve. Um, cel- you know, Basically involving ourselves, preparing ourselves for the new year, but not by going crazy in the streets. That most people in most countries were not going crazy in the streets, but were rather hearing the news and accepting the news and processing the news in a more uh, middle of the road way, perhaps a way that was more reflective of ambivalence or conflicted feelings toward the outbreak of the war. But the unity of nations around the war effort took on they became phenomena that had to be defined and maintained by the national governments. The national governments, however excited they were to see the people in the streets cheering the outbreak of war, they knew that in the long run, that enthusiasm would be tempered by the realities of war. And of course, at the beginning, many governments did not believe that the war would last much more than 6 months. Um, and even at that, they knew that in order to sustain the civilian population's enthusiasm, they would have to make efforts at it. And that started with giving a name to this enthusiasm. And each country sort of had its own um, concept of national unity that it was attempting to promote. So, for example, in Germany, this concept of national unity was called Burgfrieden. Burgfrieden, which literally means the peace, Peace, of the castle, the peace of the castle. So within the walls of the castle, you're imagining the medieval world wherein a community is under attack and everyone in the community comes within the walls of the castle for protection. And perhaps they're under siege, so perhaps they have to be confined within the walls of the castle for many days or weeks or even months. And they have to sort of unite together. They have to put aside their differences and work together with each other for the good of the defense of the community and of the castle. And so the concept of Burgfrieden in Germany was that the people of Germany had to be this people who were hunkered down inside the walls of the castle, encircled by the enemy, sort of. And therefore, they had to put aside whatever differences they had, political differences, social differences, personal differences. And so this was embodied by the scene or um, exemplified by the scene in the imperial palace where Kaiser Wilhelm, you know, accepted the pledges of all of the leaders of all of Germany's political parties as they came up and they grasped his hand and declared their allegiance to the Kaiser and to the government and their support for the war effort. And he said, I see no political parties today, only Germans. In France, this was called the Union Sacrée, the Sacred Union. And perhaps these two countries were the ones that invested the most in promoting this sense of sacred union or of the peace of the castle, this sense of national unity, because perhaps these were the two countries that were going to be sort of fighting it out in the most bloodthirsty way and would need that level of enthusiasm to be sustained. But in particular, the focus was on political parties and political sort of action groups or social movements, setting aside their difficulties, their disagreements, their rivalries in order to support the national war effort. And the most notable inclusion in this unity movement were the socialists. And this particularly refers to the Social Democratic Party. Remember that the Social Democratic Party is a political party that is internationalist in nature. It is a single political party with a unified platform and a unified sort of leadership structure, but it manifests itself in many countries in Europe, and it did 100 plus years ago prior to the outbreak of the First World War. See, the thing is that socialists are theoretically against war as it is traditionally fought. Because traditionally, what happens, as a socialist would explain it, traditionally what happens is wars are fought for the benefit of the bourgeoisie. Wars are fought for the benefit of the wealthy factory owner class. And in each country, the bourgeoisie and the state mobilize the proletariat to then do their fighting for them. So working classes, proletarians of different countries, are fed into this meat grinder. They're mobilized to make war against each other and maim and kill each other for the benefit of the bourgeoisie in their countries. That's a socialist perspective on what war is, the way that it is traditionally fought. And so to them, that's absurd. That's absurd. A socialist would say that the proletariat of France um, has more in common with the proletariat of Germany than they do with the bourgeoisie of France. That the interests of French proletarians are more in alignment with German proletarians than they are with the interests of the French bourgeoisie. And you could say that of the proletarians and the bourgeoisie of every country, that the proletarians' real interest is in uniting across national and political boundaries. Again, remember the final line of the Communist Manifesto: working men of all countries unite. So for socialists, the only war that makes any sense is the one in which the proletariat of every country unite together to overthrow the bourgeoisie of every country. And keep in mind, this is why socialists reject identification um, identification with the nation, or identification with as the citizen of a particular state. Socialists promote the idea that individuals should identify first and foremost with their class. They should identify as proletarians. Um, so, in most countries, the Social Democratic Party, or whatever the local manifestation of socialism was, in most countries it was the Social Democratic Party. In the years prior to the outbreak of the war, particularly as it grew increasingly clear that this war was coming, the socialists had threatened to resist the war efforts, the capitalist war efforts, by launching general strikes. Remember, a general strike is where all the working people go on strike. They believed and they threatened that they could essentially bring their entire societies to a grinding halt, and certainly could bring the war effort to a grinding halt by calling for these general strikes. And there was great alarm and concern among the governments of all countries that this is what would happen, that the socialists would follow through with their threat to launch general strikes in order to stop their national war efforts from moving forward. And plans were put in place um, for mass arrests and imprisonment of socialist leaders and of socialist party members in the event of the outbreak of war. What's interesting, though, is that when their countries declared war, socialists then had to make a choice. They had to make a choice between being carried away by the patriotic impulses um, that were being sparked by the war effort, or sticking with their philosophical uh, backgrounds as socialists, or sticking with their philosophical beliefs as socialists. And what's really remarkable is that for the most part, the patriotic impulse won out. In most countries, socialists succumbed to that patriotic or that national sentiment and instead rallied to their nation's war efforts rather than following through with their plans for calling for general strikes. And so, as it became clear that the socialists were going to be part of the war effort rather than attempting to obstruct it, these plans that had elaborate plans that had been put in place for the mass arrest and imprisonment of socialists were scrapped. And in many countries, as a matter of fact, where commissions were being set up by governments to run various various components of the war effort, leaders of the Social Democratic Party were oftentimes invited to join these commissions to manage the war effort, and they did. Um, now, socialist complicity in the war um, was an outrage to those socialists who did not abandon their socialist principles, who were not carried away by the sort of patriotic fervor and the patriotic impulse surrounding the war. Those who stuck to their guns, who we might call radical socialists, were absolutely outraged that so many of their fellow socialists had turned their back on the principles of socialism and had decided to join the war effort. And so, in countries where that was true, radical socialists split off to form their own separate political parties. They seceded. They walked away from the mainstream Socialist Party and formed their own radical socialist parties. In Germany, these were the independent Social Democrats, right? So your mainstream socialists who supported the war and shook the Kaiser's hand, they were the Social Democratic Party. The radical socialists who were outraged by that separated to form the independent Social Democrats, and they will sort of be at the leading edge of a kind of revolution that took place in Germany at the end of the war. Talk about that down the road. In Russia, of course, these were the Bolsheviks. The radical socialists were the Bolsheviks. The one country where this was not the case was Italy, where Italy's Socialist Party did continue to denounce the war, and attempted to disrupt the national war effort. However, in Italy, then, those who chose to secede from the Socialist Party were not the radical socialists. The radical socialists largely maintained their leadership of the party, but those who were giving in to the patriotism. Benito Mussolini being the most notable of these. He had been one of the leaders of the Socialist Party, but when Italy's Socialist Party did not support Italy's war effort, Mussolini and other nationalists seceded, or left or turned their back on socialism. Similarly, labor unions pledged to refrain from striking during the war in exchange for stricter government oversight over war industries, for government control over wages and government regulation of working conditions, and also for union leaders to have their seat at the table on these government commissions that were being established to manage the war effort. Another example of a social movement that sort of toned down its efforts was the effort of women's suffragists in Britain. In Britain, you had the Women's Social and Political Union, which had been advocating and agitating for women's suffrage for a few decades before the war broke out. And WSPU had become increasingly militant, engaging in acts of vandalism, acts of political violence against property, as they struggled to get the British House of Commons to even consider a law that would extend the vote to women. But the leaders of WSPU during the war chose to end their public protests and tone down their militancy during the war in order to support the British war effort. Now, in spite of this enthusiasm and national unity that seemed to be the natural impulse of so many civilians, every country sort of knew that they needed to work to prevent dissent, particularly as the war extended and as the nature of this war became more clear, that this was going to be a brutal war and a very long war. All the countries involved recognized the need to prevent dissent through the use of propaganda. So in Germany, the national propaganda effort was managed by the German General Staff, that is, by the army. So it was not a civilian agency in Germany that focused on the German propaganda effort, but it was rather the army itself. And in Germany, the propaganda effort was known as patriotic instruction. Patriotic instruction. So the staff of the German army not only created works of propaganda, but also closely managed what information was provided to German newspapers, which is to say that there was widespread censorship of German newspapers. German newspapers were more restricted in what information they received and what information they were therefore allowed to print than newspapers in really just about any other country. letters home from German soldiers were read by officers and censored or disposed of altogether if they contained sensitive information or if they contained discouraging information. And then the same thing was true of letters from families to their sons or husbands um, or brothers who were fighting out at the front. If letters contained messages that might be discouraging or that might give away information to soldiers on the front that the German army did not want them to have, these letters could be censored. You might receive a letter that had sections that had been cut out with a razor blade or an X-Acto knife. Portions of the letter had been literally physically excised by German officers, or the letter might not arrive at all. And for what it's worth, this particular policy of censoring letters to and from soldiers was pretty common in France and the United Kingdom as well. Um, this wasn't simply an act of a tyrannical government, being the German government. The democracies, France and Britain, proved to be equally determined to control the information that flowed to and from the soldiers out at the front. So the British established what was called the Ministry of Information to govern the control of information that was provided to newspapers and the dissemination of information, and also to manage the propaganda effort. And then when the United States joined the war, that same function was performed by a committee called the Committee of Public Information, which was chaired by a newspaper man named George Creel. So it was sometimes also called the Creel Committee. So the main messages of propaganda were to dehumanize the enemy, of course, and also to incite loyalty and support among the civilian population for the war effort. So, so obviously, um, one of the functions of propaganda was to encourage enlistment. And one way to encourage enlistment was to dehumanize the enemy. Now, the thing was that in the only countries where encouraging enlistment was extremely important were Britain and the United States, because only Britain and the United States attempted to supply their armies through voluntarism. So in all the other countries, they started with conscription. So, for example, the center poster, "Will you fight now or wait for this?" And this is a depiction of German soldiers slaughtering Belgian civilians. And so the question is, are you going to wait until Germans arrive on British shores and start shooting British civilians and harming British women, right? The way they did in Belgium. So that was one example of encouraging enlistment through dehumanizing the enemy. The American one on the right, "Destroy this mad brute, enlist in the U.S. Army." And once again, the premise is that the Germans may someday arrive on our shores, because you see that the mad brute has stepped across the ocean, which he has left in ruins, onto American soil here. Here's another one. "Your chums are fighting. Why aren't you?" So, not simply a patriotic appeal, but a sort of a personal appeal um, for British men to enlist in the armed forces, to enlist in the army. In Britain, women were actually encouraged to take part in what was called the White Feather Campaign. The White Feather Campaign. And young women were encouraged to carry in their purses these little white feathers. And if they spotted a man who appeared to be able-bodied in a military age, sort of walking around, living a civilian life, while the enlistment effort of the army was going on, women were encouraged to take the white feather out of their purse and pin it on this young man, and it was meant to be a symbol of cowardice. In some cases, women mailed white feathers to young men whom they knew who had not enlisted. So you see an example here with a note attached: "For a coward, why not take the king's shilling and defend your country?" So the king's shilling was a bonus that you got for enlisting in the army. So this was maybe the most, I don't know how to say it, personal attempt to encourage enlistment through shame, through shaming, through essentially branding those who did not enlist, those who did not volunteer for service in the army, as cowards in a very, very public way. Um, and of course, it was horrible because uh, sometimes the young men who were pinned were men who had actually been injured on the battlefield and had been sent home and now were appearing in civilian clothing. I think that was pretty rare, but it did happen. But anyway, another function of propaganda was to encourage efforts at home, whether it was to to promote to promote to promote careful use of scarce goods. So to promote being a little more being a little more careful or restrained in your consumption of food, to encourage people, especially women, to join the labor force and work in factories producing war materials, or to buy war bonds to help fund the war effort. And so that's what you're seeing there on the right. The poster on the right relates to the sale of war bonds to fund the war effort here in the United States. The one on the left is a German piece of propaganda, which essentially is saying to families, "We know you're short on food, but think of your soldiers at home, at the front. Do your best to conserve." At a time when many German civilians were barely able to eat at all, they were being encouraged to conserve so that soldiers at the front could have food. But what about dissent? As the war progressed and the death toll grew larger, um, and the horrors of the war and the nature of this war became more obvious to everyone involved, dissent did grow more common and more intense. In Britain, the British government passed a law, the Parliament passed a law called the Defence of the Realm Act, better known as DORA, DORA, the Defense of the Realm Act. And this was a very wide-ranging act that allowed the British government to, as you'll see, really put its hands on the national war effort in an unprecedented way. It allowed the British government unprecedented control over industry and agriculture and labor. But what it's most famous for are the penalties that it provided for persons who were acting in a manner that was not seen as supportive of the war. So persons engaged in activities that endangered the successful prosecution of the war, that endangered the successful carrying out of the British war effort, could be imprisoned or executed under the authority of the Defense of the Realm Act. The United States, once we joined the war, passed a series of acts known as the Espionage and Sedition Acts. The Espionage Act prohibited actions that would hinder the recruitment or enlistment of soldiers. So, the most famous example of a person who was arrested and convicted in violation of the Espionage Act was Charles Schenck. Charles Schenck was an American socialist who published a pamphlet discouraging American men from enlisting for the draft after the United States shifted to a draft. And in a rather novel way, he argued that the draft was a violation of the 13th Amendment prohibiting involuntary servitude. But that's an aside. He had printed these pamphlets and was handing them out to young men who were registering for the draft, and he was arrested because he had violated the Espionage Act. Um, he was trying to discourage. He was interfering with the recruitment and enlistment of soldiers into the U.S. Army. He challenged his arrest by questioning the constitutionality of the act. He argued that the act was a violation of his First Amendment right to freedom of speech and freedom of the press. The U.S. Supreme Court rejected his argument and upheld his conviction in the case Schenck versus the United States, arguing that freedom of speech is not, freedom of the press is not absolute, but that if certain speech or published material poses a clear and present danger to the United States and to Americans, it was not protected by the First Amendment. So that clear and present danger test was established as a result of Schenck's challenge to the Espionage Act. The Sedition Act, meanwhile, was an even more direct assault on the First Amendment. It literally made it illegal to publicly criticize the war effort or the government. Um, and so there were uh, and then going along with the Espionage and Sedition Acts, were efforts by the Committee of Public Information to encourage people to basically to report on each other. So this is a propaganda piece put out by the Committee on Public Information, and the title is "Spies and Lies," and I'll read to you what it says. German agents are everywhere, eager to gather scraps of news about our men, our ships, our munitions. It is still possible to get such information through to Germany, where thousands of these fragments, often individually harmless, are patiently pieced together into a whole which spells death to American soldiers and danger to American homes. But while the enemy is most industrious in trying to collect information and his systems are elaborate, he is not superhuman. Indeed, he is often very stupid and would fail to get what he wants were it not deliberately handed to him by the carelessness of loyal Americans. Do not discuss in public or with strangers any news of troop and transport movements or bits of gossip as to our military preparations which come into your possession. Do not permit your friends in service to tell you or write you inside facts about where they are, what they are doing and seeing. Do not become a tool of the Hun by passing on the malicious, disheartening rumors which he so eagerly sows. Remember, he asks no better service than to have you spread his lies of disasters to our soldiers and sailors, gross scandals in the Red Cross, cruelties, neglect, and wholesale executions in our camps, drunkenness and vice in the expeditionary force, and other tales certain to disturb American patriots and to bring anxiety and grief to American parents. And do not wait until you catch someone putting a bomb under a factory. Report the man who spreads pessimistic stories, divulges or seeks confidential military information, cries for peace, or belittles our efforts to win the war. Report the man who does that. Sorry, my own emphasis there. Send the names of such persons, even if they are in uniform, to the Department of Justice, Washington. Give all the details you can, with names of witnesses if possible. Show the Hun that we can beat him at his own game of collecting scattered information and putting it to work. The fact that you made the report will not become public. So the Creel Committee, the Committee on Public Information, was in fact recruiting American civilians into the effort to to nail people who were violating the Espionage and Sedition Acts. I mentioned that that the British Defense of the Realm Act provided for execution as one of the options available as punishment for violators. 10 British civilians were executed in violation of the Defense of the Realm Act. There were no executions in the United States for violations of the Espionage and Sedition Act, though around 1,000 Americans were arrested and convicted of violations, including Charles Schenck. Um, In France and in Germany, states of siege were declared, effectively martial law, and any person who spoke out against the war could be accused of what was called defeatism and imprisoned or executed. Soldiers were executed, of course, for desertion. So if soldiers dissented against the war and deserted, they could be executed for desertion or cowardice. Austria-Hungary led the way with 1,148 soldiers executed during the war. You'll see that Austria-Hungary's army faced particular complications because of the multinational nature of Austria-Hungary and of its army. Italy was second with 750 soldiers executed, France third with 650, the United Kingdom with 360, and interestingly, Germany with only 48 executions of soldiers during the war. So that's as far as we need to go talking about enthusiasm and dissent. This provides the context to understand the sacrifices that will be asked of civilians in order to promote their country's war effort. And so we'll now move on to, in our upcoming lessons, we'll move on to how the belligerent countries mobilized human and economic resources in an effort to win the war. So until then, take care of yourselves. As always, I hope you are healthy and safe, and I do look forward to teaching you again soon. Take care, IB History Year 1 students. Bye-bye.